Dr. Dussel Peters, we want to ask you about US tariffs and trade war against Mexico. But before jumping into that, it seems important to first discuss Mexico's relationship with China. Can you discuss Mexico-China relations, both in terms of trade and beyond?
I think that to respond to your question, it is important to understand two or three concepts in order not to fall into the descriptive trap in terms of their relationship of China with the world, with the United States, but also with Mexico, Latin America, and other countries. No, first concept that I believe is relevant is the concept of new triangular relationships. This concept runs against, or if you want to, is an alternative to recent discussions on the Cold War or the new Cold War, which I humbly believe is not very useful, considering that the concept was used 50 years ago in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. For younger generations, they don't even know what the Soviet Union is. And so apparently China is something like the Soviet Union. This again is not very useful. What we are witnessing today, and at least for a decade, is a systemic competition between China and the United States, and a profound confrontation between the two biggest economies of the world. This goes far beyond economics, far beyond trade, investments, and other economic issues, but refers also to cultural competition, issues regarding tourism, electric vehicles, and many other topics. No, and so new triangular relationships refers to the topic of this confrontation, systemic competition between both countries, different political systems, different economic systems. And so the big challenge is for third regions, Latin America, Africa, Asia, also the European community, and countries, Mexico, Belize, Vietnam, but also Germany and the UK, among others. No? How will third countries respond to this confrontation? And this is a very pragmatic issue in terms of hundreds of issues, from 6G to Confucius Institutes, to trade, to tariffs, as we will discuss in a moment, etc. First concept, new triangular relationships. And the second concept, security shoring. Today, it is very fashionable to discuss the topic of nearshoring and lots of other shorings, no? Onshoring, offshoring, ally-shoring, friend-shoring, nearshoring. When you ask the authors what do they mean by this nearshoring, they usually respond that it refers to the transfer of segments of global value chains. This, however, has happened for more than 50 years. I remind you, Mexico has been benefiting through maquiladoras, also Central America, Vietnam, and other countries, for 50 years from this transfer. So again, nearshoring is, I humbly believe, not a very intelligent concept. I would, with a little bit of irony, but with all seriousness, I would invite you to consider the concept of security shoring. This refers very specifically to new policies of the United States since 2022, not since 1965, no? But since 2022, in which authors such as Jake Sullivan, particularly Janet Yellen, but also Blinken, the White House, have highlighted that the national security of the United States will be the main topic and issue in its relationship with China. This means that issues such as free trade, innovation, technology, but also culture and exchange of education and in academic activities will be all under the umbrella of national security shoring. I will get back in the interview to this concept of security shoring. So now, yes, I will respond to your question. Sorry for the long introduction, so the relationship between China and Mexico is a long relationship. It's a mature relationship. It's an in-depth relationship. It's an extensive relationship. No, formally. Mexico and China began diplomatic relations at the end of the 19th century. No, of course, also since 1949. In 1972, the People's Republic of China and Mexico began with diplomatic relationships. So we are speaking of more than 53 years of diplomatic ties between both countries. I would highlight that this relationship in the last 50 years has changed importantly. At the beginning of the diplomatic relationship in 1972, the political ties were particularly important. Yes, in this period under the Cold War, no? And this has evolved and shifted since the 1980s and 1990s in a more profound economic relationship. I remind you, in 1972, the economic relationship between China and Mexico was practically non-existent. No? Today, and since 2003, which means more than 20 years, China has been the second major trading partner of Mexico. No? As a matter of fact, in 2024, Mexico's trade and imports from China broke the barrier of 20%, which means more than 20% of Mexico's imports come from China. No? This is for the first time, again, remember, in the 1970s, the trade relationship was close to 0%, non-existent. No? So there has been a tremendous intensification in terms of trade, also growing in terms of investments. No? At the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies that I coordinate, and also at the Academic Network for Latin America and the Caribbean on China, Red ILSA China, we do an annual report, a monitor on China's OFDI, overseas foreign direct investment, for Chinese investments in Latin America and the Caribbean, including, of course, Mexico. No? And so in this annual report that we publish in Chinese, in Spanish, and in English annually since 2017, we are witnessing a growing presence of Chinese investments all over Latin America, including Mexico. No? I would finish in qualitative terms, if you want to, highlighting the qualitative importance of China's presence in Mexico. Jokingly, but in serious terms, I could mention lots of different results of articles, books, conferences, etc. I would highlight, let's imagine one day without China in Mexico. No? We would be walking barefoot, without underwear, telecommunications, like the one we are holding now, would not work because most of Wi-Fi and telecommunications is done through Chinese antennas of Chinese firms. No? Ports, airports, and other infrastructure, subways, metros would not work either, etc., etc. So China's presence in Latin America and Mexico is really important. This is not to say that the presence of other countries, the United States, the European Union, is also important. But again, welcome to this new triangular relationship. In the case of Mexico, we have the presence of the United States, which is undisputed, and of China. And the country such as Mexico has to deal with both. This is fundamental in terms of not falling into the trap of choosing between the United States and China. Countries such as Mexico and most of Latin America, even countries that do not have diplomatic ties with China today, such as Paraguay and Guatemala, among others, all of them have strong ties, in some cases stronger in trade, less so in financing, more in infrastructure, with both the United States and China, which means that countries in Latin America, including Mexico, require a strategy, an agenda vis-a-vis both the United States and China. The issue is fundamental. It's not a matter of China or the United States, but both.
Dr. Dussel Peters, what do you make of Washington's belief that Mexico serves as a backdoor for Chinese goods getting into the U.S.?
This discussion began in the midst of 2024, last year, in the electoral discussion of the Biden administration and the candidate Biden, then Harris, and the candidate Trump, now president. No? Here, I would humbly say, very unfortunately, the so-called think tanks in DC, in the case and in the discussion of Latin America and the Caribbean and China, they have not been doing their homework. No? So the think tanks are neither think nor tanks regarding this relationship. No, we have been discussing this topic for a long time in Latin America, business organizations, the public sector, but also the academic institutions such as Cechimex and Red ALC China. No, so. Again, the concept of new triangular relationships is fundamental. China's presence in Latin America has been increasing, as I highlighted, quantitatively and qualitatively in the case of Mexico. No? Recently, we have calculated based on input-output tables the following. So 7.5% of Mexican exports to the United States in 2020 is Chinese value added. With this result, we would support the opinion, if you want to, of some sectors in Washington highlighting, I told you so. No? So Mexico is becoming the backdoor. In 1995, Chinese value added in Mexico's exports to the US was 0%, and this increased continuously for 25 years to 7.5%. But who imports in Mexico? Imports in general from the world and from China. 70% of Mexican imports are being done and pursued by international transnational corporations, foreign firms, mainly US firms. So again, back to the concept of new triangular relationships. Yes, Mexico exports parts and components made in China and also made by Chinese firms in Mexico. Their presence has been growing in the last 25 years, as I have highlighted. But the main importers in Mexico are US American firms, General Motors, Ford, Stellantis. They incorporate and integrate hundreds of components in a car that says made in Mexico. The components come mainly from the United States, but also from Germany, from Brazil, from Japan, Korea, and from China. No? So we have a very complicated new triangular relationship, and very unfortunately, the political discussion in Washington since the middle of 2024 does not recognize and sufficiently understand this complex new industrial structure. No? So we have US American firms established in Mexico. We have exports from Mexico to the United States. And by the way, also the United States, Canada, and many other countries import parts and components from China to elaborate a final good. This could be a monitor, a computer, a car, a telecommunication. So you have hundreds of global value chains. And so it is important in this political discussion, considering this systemic competition between the United States, security shoring between the US and China, it is important to simply understand the current industrial structure that exists, that has been evolving for decades. And if you want to change them, this will not happen in a weekend. This will not happen in weeks, months, or even years. This has been evolving and shifting for decades in the 21st century. And I humbly believe that the discussion in Washington and by President Trump raising tariffs, etc., they have to understand the complexity and depth in which mainly US American firms, also Japanese, European, also Chinese firms, have been involved. If you do not understand this complex industrial structure, political discussions might result in apparently quick solutions, such as imposing tariffs, such as accusing Mexico being a backdoor for Chinese imports to the US. No?
To Dussel Peters, we also wanted to get your assessment of the US tariffs and trade war against Mexico. What do you think the US goals are regarding its tariffs on Mexico? How effective do you think the US tariffs will be in achieving its goals? And what, if any, impacts do you think U.S. tariffs against Mexico will have on Mexico in the near, mezzo, and long term?
Look, today, in the middle of April of 2025, the situation is very chaotic. No? To put it politely and diplomatically, we are witnessing a chaotic situation in which the White House in the United States and President Trump have changed fundamentally its policies regarding tariffs. No? So we began with a list in early April with a list of the so-called reciprocal tariffs. No? However, on April 9th, at 0 o'clock, no, the Trump administration attempted to impose and implement these tariffs. 12 hours later, the Trump administration suspended these reciprocal tariffs and called for a 90-day suspension, which does not mean cancellation, but for a 90-day suspension in order to allow for negotiations, with the big exception of China. No? In the case of China, China took reciprocal measures, and so tariffs have escalated between the US and China to effective tariffs in average of almost 150%, 125% of new tariffs, and 15+% of already existing tariffs until 2024. No? So the result in this confrontation, security shoring between the US and China has been an escalation in which Both parts are practically saying tariffs will be almost impossible between China and the US. What has been the result today in the middle of April of 2025? What is the result for Mexico? A big uncertainty, by the way, not only for Mexican firms, not only for Chinese firms established in Mexico, but mainly for US American firms established in Mexico, which are the main motor of exports to the United States. Imagine firms that have been exporting from Mexico for decades, no? They have been exporting whatever you can imagine, no? From garments to telecommunications, electronics, auto parts, automobiles, etc., etc., etc. Hundreds of billions of US dollars, and they have been increasing the scale and scope of their exports, supported by NAFTA, signed in 1994, by USMCA, signed by the first Trump administration in 2020, and they are suddenly told that they will have to start paying huge tariffs, no, for their exports to the US. The situation is very chaotic. Apparently, Mexico has somehow benefited in comparison with the rest of the world. Apparently, Mexico will not have to pay these basic tariffs of 10% in comparison to the rest of the world, but Mexico is highly dependent on its exports in auto parts and automobiles to the US. This will have to pay a 25% tariff. Again, this will be negotiated in the next 90 days. Apparently, Mexico will only have to pay tariffs on the non-regional value added and the non-US American value added. Around 50% of Mexican exports to the US account or are originated in the United States and in North America. So the other half will have to pay either 10% or 25%. And in addition, I remind you, the US has raised tariffs also on steel and aluminum. So highly complex today, in the middle of April, highly complex in the next 90 days. Nobody knows exactly what will result out of this. I would simply finally highlight that the Trump administration has understood that the markets, this is apparently the main threat to the Trump administration, that the markets, the stock markets, but also the interest rates for the US Treasury bonds in the United States have been so far the only factors that have been able to allow for this suspension. No? In my analysis, why did the Trump administration suspend this overall reciprocal tariffs on April 9th? The suspension and to allow for a 90-day negotiation process was a result of the dramatic fall of the stock markets and, as important, the increase of the interest rates, the long-term interest rates in the US Treasury bond markets. This has enormous impacts in the interest payments of the United States, and this was the reason why President Trump suspended these reciprocal tariffs on April 9th. No? So again, big uncertainty, mainly for US firms established in Mexico that have been exporting for decades from Mexico to the United States.
Dussel Peters, as a follow-up, what impact do you think the US tariffs against Mexico will have on US firms in Mexico?
Well, again, we've been talking with a good group of firms, not all of them. We're speaking of tens of thousands of US firms established in Mexico. But in the last at least 9 months, this is again since the middle of 2024, when all this discussion began regarding Mexico becoming a backdoor for Chinese imports, which, by the way, was first raised in the electoral discussion in the US by President and candidate Biden, Joseph Biden, no? This has resulted in the impossibility of these U.S. firms to increase their investments in Mexico. No, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a CEO of one of these firms, which could be big firms, but also smaller firms, U.S. American firms established in Mexico. How will they invest since the middle of last year if they do not know if they will pay a 0% tariff, or they will pay a 10% tariff, or a 25% tariff, or even a tariff beyond 50%. I remind you, and this is being forgotten in most of the analysis on this tariff war. In 2023, Mexico paid, in average, for all of its exports to the United States, an average tariff of 0.26%, no, less than 1%. So one of the main factors that incentivated exports from Mexico to the United States as a result of NAFTA and USMCA were low tariffs and low transportation costs. The transportation costs will be similar in 2024, 2025. However, tariffs, if Mexico will have to start paying 10%, 25%, or more, 25% is almost 98 times more of what Mexico was paying in tariffs, in terms of tariffs, if you compare 0.26% and 25%. No, tariffs matter. No, so U.S. American firms established in Mexico do not have usually a rate of return or a profit rate of 25%, which they can absorb. No, so they will have to seriously consider staying in Mexico, going to Vietnam, going to Central America, going to the United States. No, very clearly, the strategy of the Trump administration is that U.S. firms invest in the United States in manufacturing. But again, remember, no, in most of the cases, we're speaking of segments of global value chains of low value added, low wages, no? In some cases also with important environmental impacts at the local level, at the regional level. No? So I cannot imagine new U.S. American firms establishing rubber chemical production, tires production in Washington, in Boston, in Los Angeles, or in San Diego. No? This will be from an environmental perspective, and from a wage perspective, there will be simply no incentive in these localities in the United States to attract such a kind of investment, and it will be very difficult in the US to find labor power that is interested in working for a couple of dollars an hour.
Dussel Peters, what is your assessment of Claudia Sheinbaum, the Morena Party, and how they are and will continue to navigate U.S. President Trump and U.S. aggression against Mexico?
Look, President Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, she has been attempting to be cool-headed, as we say in Mexico, trying not to engage directly to the massive provocations of the United States, provocations and the impossibility, I would say, from an analyst perspective, the impossibility of understanding a strategy. No? So you have a dialogue between Mexico and the United States at all levels regarding fentanyl, drugs, regarding migration, regarding water, energy, and dozens of other topics. And independently of this cooperation, dialogue, and the possibility of achieving results in the short term, independently of these efforts by both parts, the US and Mexico, independently of that, Mexico is treated like any other country through these reciprocal tariffs, among others. This might be surprising for some. No? Some might say, well, all these negotiations are not very useful. Tariffs against Mexico continue with these negotiations prior to the reciprocal tariffs or without them. No? Nevertheless, again, I believe that the Mexican executive and presidency has been attempting not to engage in these continuous provocations, accusations by different people in the US government. No? So the result was or has been so far, we will witness in the next 90 days, times counting. No? So today, in reality, we're speaking not of 90, but 85 days or less than 85 days. And day by day, we will achieve, in 90 days, we'll see the results. No? Mexico, the Mexican presidency has been attempting not to engage in this retaliation, such as China. No? So Mexico has waited for a negotiation instead of automatically imposing tariffs such as in the US. No? The expectation of Mexico is that Mexico will achieve within the USMCA a good treatment. No? So far, the big question for Mexico would be if Mexico will have to pay in steel, aluminum, auto parts, and automobiles, if Mexico will have to pay a 25% tariff like the rest of the world, or if they will be included within USMCA. Until today, apparently, these three global value chains and imports from the United States will not be integrated within USMCA. But again, welcome to a discussion. I remind you here, Mexico is in a very singular situation. No? So Mexico has diversified its trade in the last 25, 30 years in the 21st century, diversified its trade in the late 1990s, almost 85%, 81%, 1999 of Mexico's trade was done with the United States. This has fallen from 81% to 61%, a very important shift. However, Mexican exports are still highly concentrated in the United States. In 2024, 84% of Mexican exports went to the United States. Where has Mexico diversified its trades? Its trade mainly in imports. No? So in the late 1990s, Mexico imported more than 3/4 of its imports from the United States. This has fallen from more than 75% to 46% in 2024. What is the reason? Mainly Asia and particularly China. No? So Mexico is highly dependent on imports but even more so in exports, in particular value-added chains such as auto parts, automobiles, electronics, and telecommunications, among others. So Mexico is in this new triangular relationship, as many other Latin American countries. Mexico is in a very particular situation and highly dependent of the United States, but through imports also from China.
April 3rd, 2025, there was an article in Forbes with the headline, Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim is biggest winner amid tariff rout, as stocks tanked following news of President Trump's new tariffs. Mexican telecom tycoon Carlos Slim Helú got billions richer. Dr. Dussel Peters, for those in the audience that may not know who Carlos Slim Helú is, who is he? And more importantly, what is your reaction to the article in Forbes about Carlos Slim Helú?
Well, again, Carlos Slim, engineer Carlos Slim, is the richest man, billionaire in Mexico, also in Latin America. He used to be at one point even one of the richest persons of the world, no? Personally, I always think if there would be 10 Carlos Slim in Mexico, the economic situation in Mexico would be very different, no? He has inherited practically for a very low price Teléfonos de México under the presidency of Carlos Salinas de Gortari. However, in spite of this privatization process and again achieving for a very low price Teléfonos de México, as many other industrialists in Mexico and billionaires today in Mexico, Carlos Slim was able to upgrade substantially Teléfonos de México so that it became one of the biggest firms of Latin America with investments all over Latin America. No, he has allowed for an excellent treatment of the workers within Teléfonos de México and Grupo Carso. No, contrary to many other concessions and privatization processes in Mexico, in which some of these billionaires inherited or got for a very low price mines, manufacturing sites, and other concessions during the presidency of Salinas de Gortari. Surprisingly, he has kept a very national, not to say nationalistic perspective of Mexico, the importance of the domestic market, of keeping high taxes, even for his own firm, which might be surprising, no? So again, I would say he's an intelligent engineer, no? An important businessman in Mexico, which has been able to put his eggs in a lot of nests in different political parties. He also has investments in Mexico with Chinese firms in the automobile sector, but also ties with US firms in Latin America, etc. No? So he does not have the luxury, if you want to only invest in one political party, in one firm. Grupo Carso today has, again, is highly diversified in manufacturing sites, in telecommunications, in the financial sector, etc.
Dussel Peters, you also very recently published the critically important book entitled Latin America, China, and Great Power Competition, New Triangular Relationships. Your new book is not only forward-looking, but it addresses arguably the most critical questions confronting not just Latin America and the Caribbean, but globally. Namely, what are China's goals in Latin America and the Caribbean? Is its presence there a good thing for the region? What challenges does it create? How is the U.S. responding? Of course, after we finish reading this important book, we hope, and would be honored for you to come back on the show to discuss your new book in further detail. but both as your book seems to directly or indirectly relate to our discussion today, and also as a sort of a teaser for us all. Can you provide us an overview of your book?
Well, thank you very much for highlighting the book. The book is a result of almost 25 years working on China, Latin America, and Caribbean issues. In the book, in the first chapters, I highlight a group of concepts in order to understand China today, no? The public sector in China, which is extremely interesting, a globalization process with Chinese characteristics. This does not mean that I am necessarily positive or negative to China, but simply the requirement today in the 21st century and in 2025 to understand China. From a Chinese perspective, no? If we do not do this, and if we simply come up with Western external concepts, we will simply not understand Mexico, not but China, no. And so, from this perspective, understanding a group of economic, social, political economy concepts, the book engages in detailed discussions on trade, on financing, on infrastructure projects, on investment topics. And in each of the chapters, we will find detailed characteristics of the China-Latin American socioeconomic relationship. I include also a chapter regarding institutions between Latin America and China, in Latin America, public official institutions, but also private business organizations and academic institutions that are working on Latin America and China. Surprisingly, these institutions are very weak, no? Independently of the increasing presence of China in Latin America. By the way, also of Latin America and China, we have to improve the quality of the institutions, no? So the book ends with a group of proposals, in some cases provocative proposals for future researchers to engage in the current ongoing discussions between Latin America and China, I would say, in order not to fall into the trap of many of these think tanks in Washington that do not integrate the work that has been done neither in Latin America nor in China regarding a very complex, in-depth and extensive and mature relationship, no? In the case of Mexico, as we discussed a moment ago, we have diplomatic ties for more than 50 years, no? So the mature relationship between both parts in hundreds of topics, from culture to exchanges in museums, in academics, between universities, and of course regarding trade, infrastructure, and other topics, this has to be accounted for. You cannot begin a discussion in 2024 like the US and the so-called think tanks. You cannot begin a discussion since 2024. You have to go back on each of these topics. In the case of investments, for example, China has been increasing investments for 15 years. No? So you cannot start the discussion since security shoring in the last 2 or 3 years, but you have to understand the structures that have evolved in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think this will be a very rich discussion in the academic field, not to speak of the policy field. Now the issue of tariffs have become fashionable, if you want to, but again, here it is important to have a group of concepts to engage into this tariff discussion. Otherwise, you fall into the description trap, no? So trade increased in March by 3%, and it fell in April by 4%, and you could put to sleep anybody with hundreds of gigas of information. concepts, structures, methodologies for analysis are fundamental for these discussions today and in the future, I humbly propose.
Those are all of the questions we have for you for today. Is there anything else you think we should discuss today that we haven't yet covered?
No, I would simply invite your audience to consider again the already existing discussions on Latin America and the Caribbean and China to integrate to the discussions that already have been going on in Latin America and the Caribbean and in China for decades. You have some institutions in Latin America, but also in China, that have been working on these topics for more than 50 years. No? So it is important not to reinvent the wheel, but to do a detailed research to discuss issues such as tariffs, but also infrastructure projects, and not to speak of cultural exchanges, etc., to understand the depth and maturity of the relationship. We have to integrate and not to reinvent the wheel in many cases.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.